And greetings, saints of the Most High. This is Rod Thomas coming to you from the DFW. Well, on a rather overcast, with a threat of rain preparation day, which is leading into our weekly Sabbath tomorrow. And I want to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to fellowship with me here on this upcoming blessed day of rest in Yeshua Messiah. And as always, beloved, it is my hope, trust, and prayer that this installment of the Messianic Torah Observer finds you, your families, and your fellowships well and blessed. And so, as I'm recording and publishing this installment of the Messianic Torah Observer, it is July 5th, 2024, and we are just 2 days away, folks, away from the start of the fourth month of Yah's biblical calendar year. In fact, searchers in the land, embedded in the land of Yisrael, are planning on going out on Sunday, this coming Sunday, 2 days away, July 7th, and attempt to sight the fourth renewed moon of this biblical calendar year. And as always, we will keep you posted on our website, the Messianic Torah Observer.org, the Messianic Torah Observer.org, as to the results of their findings, their search. It's on the landing page. You go about midway down and you'll see over to the left our announcements in terms of the biblical calendar. So you can check out and see where we are in terms of Yah's reckoning of time. On another note, I have to say that I'm glad to be back with you today, having been out of town for the better part of 3 weeks. As I mentioned in the last installment before I went on this kind of mini hiatus, I had some family business to attend to back east. Then last week, I accompanied Hillary as she delivered 3 spirit-filled and content-rich teachings at the Surge Women's Conference 2024 in Waxahachie, Texas. It was it was a very busy week last week and into the weekend, but Yah delivered us. It's been stressful, a stressful 2.5 weeks, but Yah is gracious. Yah is good. Yah is awesome. But I will have to say, I will have to be transparent and confess that we are both ecstatic to be back here in the DFW and back to work for the kingdom. I guess you could say as we were working over in the Surge Women's Conference in Waxahachie, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Please don't hold that against me if I'm not. But we were kind of attending to some of the kingdom's business and maybe a little bit over in the East Coast as I'm taking care of family matters, my dad, and taking care of his affairs and things. But I'm talking about our ministry work in terms of writing and creating content and things like that. So we're happy to be back. And with that, I'm not going to continue rambling about. Why don't we just get into Yah's word today? I wanted to make sure that I put something out to stay up with the word I made to you. I made a promise that we would be back about this time in my last post, and I wanted to keep my word on that. So what do you say we get into Yah's word today? Today we're going to get back into some of our Torah reading examinations. This will be the 139th reading of our 3-year Torah reading cycle, and it is found in Deuteronomy, Devarim, chapter 17, only verses 1 through 20. And it is a continuation of reading 138, which would have been last week's reading, which we did not cover. But I've gone ahead and I've entitled this teaching can stand alone. Reading 139 does not depend upon a reading of 138 in order to understand and gain and glean some of the riches that are contained therein. But I've gone ahead and I've entitled this teaching for this week, and it's a long one, so here we go. Offering unblemished animal sacrifices, idolatry and paganism warrants capital punishment, God's choice of king to reign over us. And this is my thoughts and reflections on Torah Reading 139. As you can tell, I don't put a tremendous amount of effort and stock into titling these teachings, but more to just give you a flavor of what the content and what some of the things we're going to be talking about are in terms of the teaching that I will be conducting here on this reading. Now, the overriding theme of last week's reading, just to get you caught up, has to do with Yehovah, Yah, being desirous for his people to always exist in a state of perpetual shalom. And when we talk about shalom, we're talking about, and I like to frame shalom as a holistic peace, a whole rounded peace that encompasses every aspect of Yah's chosen one's life. And this intended shalom, this intended peace, if you will, that Yah desires for us to perpetually exist in, is achieved only through his stipulated or commanded righteousness. That is, walking in his instructions in righteousness. So when we fail or we refuse to walk in Yah's righteousness, either individually or collectively as a community, we will not enjoy a life of shalom and peace. In fact, we will endure a life of hardship, a life of chaos, a life filled with trials and tribulations. And we see this clearly illustrated throughout Yisrael's history. And if Yisrael's history is not enough to convince us of this reality, simply look at the state of the world today. In particular, this nation, the United States. The citizens of this world today are not enjoying, I think we can all agree, they are not enjoying true shalom. But rather, they're enduring chaos, turmoil, hardships, and so forth. Why is this? Because the nation peoples of this world have chosen to place their trust, place their lives, and even their eternal security in their governments, in their leaders, in their loved ones' hands, rather than in the creator of the universe. Their failure, their refusal to walk in Yah's holy and righteous ways have brought about the perilous times we are all witnessing today, with shalom, with peace being just a wishful thought for the vast majority. Righteousness in any community walks hand in hand with justice. And where there is no true justice in a community, or nation for that matter, righteousness will always be a vanishing or an outright absent commodity. And this is a reality that Moshe addresses in our reading today. Consequently, all of these concepts are inextricably linked. Of this inextricable link, when I'm talking about these concepts, I'm talking about justice, shalom, righteousness. They're all inextricably linked. And Moses addresses all of these in our reading today. Of this inextricable link between justice, shalom, righteousness, Torah teacher, and I call him prolific Messianic writer, Tim Haig of Torah Resources wrote, "Note this progression carefully. Justice, righteousness, peace, joy. Justice, righteousness, peace, joy." So in order for justice, righteousness, peace, and joy to exist in the community or nation, Yah put in place an intricate government structure. And Hebraically, we have 4 God-sanctioned institutions to run this government structure. The first sanctioned institution is that of judges. Judges, also known as the Sophatim, or officials. Judges, Sophatim. It falls to judges under the Hebraic umbrella, under Yah's way of life, to enforce Yah's laws, his edicts, his statutes, his commandments. And in order for this law enforcement to occur, as Yah demands, the appointed judges must always pursue justice. Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 20. It reads, "Justice, only justice, you shall pursue, so that you may live, and you shall take possession of the land that Jehovah your God is giving to you." And that is, again, Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 20, the Lexham English Bible rendering. Now, these judges, which I'll call true justice warriors, they're true justice warriors, not the milquetoast, crazy, violent, ignorant justice warriors we have strewn throughout the Western world today that seek to only foster chaos and to put forth a liberal and evil, a kingdom of darkness agenda. We're talking about true justice warriors. These operated from local courts, and they addressed every matter of apostasy. And this is all lined out for you in Deuteronomy chapter 16, verses 18 through chapter 17, verse 7. We find in our reading and in these other references, such as in Deuteronomy 16, that Jehovah prefers righteous justice over that of sacrifices. Proverbs chapter 21, verse 3. And this is kind of counterintuitive to many who are in tune with this kind of thing, the Hebrew way of life. Most people put so much stock into just making sure you get that sacrifice in. And yet, after they get the sacrifice in, they live like hellions throughout the rest of the time until the next sacrifice. But that's not what Father wants. Father said he prefers righteous justice over that of sacrifice. He's not saying don't do sacrifices. He's saying you do sacrifices with the right heart, but you must live righteous and just lives. And the people who I place over you as judges and leaders must operate under righteous justice, or operate through righteous judgment. You know, there is a spiritual link between corrupt judges and idolatry. For the judge that refuses or cannot judge righteously essentially engages in a form of idolatry. This according to, again, Tim Haig in his commentary on this Torah reading. How so, you may ask? Well, simply the judge who refuses or who cannot render righteous judgment has effectively done what? He has submitted himself not to Jehovah's instructions in righteousness, but to their own way, their own thoughts, their own feelings and opinions and their own political leanings, evil ways and such. And they are operating in the ways of the world, not in the set apart ways of Jehovah. But Yah requires passionate, righteous, just judges. The other institution is kings. In the Hebrew, melech. Melech, that should be familiar to all of us. We hear it spoken quite a bit here in the Messianic circle. This one is appointed by Jehovah. And he is appointed by Jehovah by the mouth of Jehovah's prophets. Yah would have much preferred that we not have a king rule over us for obvious human reasons. You know, when you have a human king, they're going to act like humans. They're flawed beings. They're sinful humans. So they're going to act many times in accordance with their own desires, their own worldview, their own opinions, their own desires. But Yah would much prefer to rule over us himself, as would be found in a true theocracy. And a theocracy is where Yah rules over the nation. But because of the hardness of our hearts, well, Yah would permit us to have a human king reign over us as long as that king was appointed by him through his prophet, and the king ruled in accordance to Yah's precepts and statutes. And we're going to go over, this is the third portion of our reading today, where Yah stipulates the standards by which a king can be installed and reign over us. It's a very interesting concept because it defies the standards by which the vast majority, if not all, of the rulers of this day stand and operate out of. Completely opposite. That's why we have so much chaos, so much evil in the world, because they're not operating under God's strict and meticulous and holy and righteous standards. The third institution is that of the Levitical priest, or the Kohanim. And we all know about the Kohanim, the Levitical priesthood. It was established by Jehovah at Sinai. And we've done quite a bit of talk about the Levitical priesthood. And it's not very much mentioned here directly, but it has a very prominent institutional place in terms of justice, righteousness, peace, and joy. And the fourth institution is the prophets, or the Navaim, And Yah chose his true prophets, and he put his words in their mouths. You just don't wake up one day and say, I'm going to be a prophet. I aspire to be a prophet. Yah has to choose you, and he puts his words in your mouth. And it should be obvious to all that our Master Yeshua HaMashiach, Yeshua Messiah, fulfills each of these offices, these institutions, that of the judge, the king, the priest, not the Levitical priest, but the priest of the order of the Melchizedek, and the prophet. Yeshua Messiah fulfills each of these offices and institutions, individually and collectively, except again for the priesthood. His priesthood is derived not of the Levitical, but of the order of the Melchizedek, the Melchizedek. And this is all laid out for us in Psalm chapter 100, verse 10, verse 4, Hebrews chapter 5, verse 6, Hebrews chapter 6, verse 20, and Hebrews chapter 7, verse 17. Now, our reading for this week, 139, of our 3-year Torah reading cycle may be broken down into 3 main sections. And we're going to cover each of these main sections, although we will not be reading the all 20 verses for the sake of time. I am just going to go and give you an overview of each of those sections and leave the reading of the portion, the Torah portion, to you when you are so led to read it. But there are 3 main sections. The first section is an acceptable worship or sacrifices. What Yah requires of our sacrifices and our offerings, our animal sacrifices, our offerings. Number 2 section is dealing with apostasy, or dealing with apostates in our midst. And this is where the judicial system comes in. This is where the judges come in. This is where the priesthood comes in. And the third section is that of installing, as I mentioned just a minute ago, a king to rule over us based upon the strict exacting standards that Yah put forth here in his instructions in righteousness. So let's go through each of these sections, and then we'll wrap it up with practical applications at the end. Section 1, acceptable worship. Acceptable animal sacrifices. And we find this only in one verse of the 20 verses of our Torah reading for today. And it's verse 1, where again, we are in Deuteronomy chapter 17, and we're looking at verse 1. And we find in this verse that only unblemished sacrifices may be rendered unto Jehovah. And this, of course, foreshadows Yeshua as our flawless, our unblemished atoning sacrifice for the sins of humanity, the sins of the world. Secondly, it signals the necessity of our rendering to Jehovah our very best. We must not skimp in our offerings, in our sacrifices. When you hear the word sacrifices, it means just that. It has to incur some cost to us. It must be a sacrifice. When we give it, it has to be something that we feel. Whether it's feeling in a monetary sense, in a physical sense, in a spiritual sense, when we give unto Yah, when we sacrifice unto Yah. To render a blemished sacrifice, especially in light of such sacrifices being shadow pictures of Yeshua's unblemished, perfect offering of himself for the sins of the world, would, as Tim Haig states, muddy the picture of Yeshua's sacrificial death. Again, this is from his commentary on this Torah reading. When we offer to Yah an unblemished sacrifice, it helps ensure Yah's acceptance of our offering. And again, when we follow Yah's instructions to the letter, and also when we follow it in spirit and truth to the best of our ability, we help ensure Yah's acceptance, but it is also based upon the state of our heart. Whether or not our heart is right, as well as it testifies to the perfect sacrifice of our Master Yeshua. Now, this commandment regarding the necessity of offering an unblemished offering, sacrifice, animal sacrifice, is another reminder from Jehovah's previous mention of what constitutes an acceptable offering, an acceptable animal sacrifice. We find this back in Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 21. But if there is a physical defect in it, speaking of the animal sacrifice, such as lameness or blindness, any serious defect, you shall not sacrifice it to Jehovah your Elohim. Another reminder, another section is found in Leviticus chapter 22, verses 17 through 25. And it reads, Then Jehovah spoke to Moses, saying, verse 18, Speak to Aaron and his sons and to all the Israelites, and say to them, Anyone from the house of Israel or from the alien in Israel who presents his offering for any of their vows or for any of their free will offerings that they present to Jehovah as a burnt offering, verse 19, it must be without defect in order for it to be acceptable for you. A male among the cattle, among the sheep, or among the goats, verse 20. You shall not present any animal in which is a physical defect, because it shall not be acceptable for you, verse 21. And if anyone brings a sacrifice of fellowship offerings for Jehovah to fulfill a vow or as a free will offering from the cattle or from the flock, it must be without defect, in order again to be acceptable. There must not be any physical defect in it. Verse 22, the blind or the injured or the maimed or the seeping or one with a skin disorder or one with a skin eruption, these you shall not present to Jehovah, nor shall you give from them an offering made by fire on the altar of Jehovah. Verse 23, as for an ox or sheep that is deformed or that is stunted, you may present it as a free will offering, but for a vow it will not be accepted. Verse 24, and you shall not present anything for Jehovah with bruised or shattered or torn or cut off testicles, and you shall not sacrifice such in your land. Verse 25, and you shall not present your God's food, talking about the animal sacrifice, from any of these by the hand of a foreigner. Why? Because their deformity is in them. A physical defect is in them. They shall not be accepted for you. Again, that was Leviticus chapter 22, verses 17 through 24. So why then, let me ask you this, why did Jehovah care so much about the quality of sacrifice we rendered unto him? Why did he require us to render unto him an unblemished, as perfect as possible animal sacrifice? Well, he explained it to us through his prophet. Going over to Malachi chapter 1, verses 6 through 9. And the Lexham English Bible reads, a son honors his father, and a slave his master. But if I am a father, where is my honor? And if I am a master, where is my reverence? Says Jehovah Sabaoth to you. O priest, you who despise my name. But you say, how have we despised your name? Verse 7. You are presenting defiled food on my altar. But then you ask, how have we defiled you? By saying that the table of Jehovah is despised. Verse 8. So when you offer a blind animal for sacrifice, is that not wrong? And when you offer the lame and the one who is ill, is that not wrong? Present it, please, to your governor. Will he be pleased with you? Will he show you favor, says Jehovah Sabaoth. Verse 9. So then, implore the favor of Jehovah, of God, so that he will be gracious to us. This is what you have done. Will he show favor to any of you, says Jehovah of hosts, Jehovah Sabaoth. Again, that was Malachi chapter 1, verses 6 through 9. So when we dare to offer inferior blemished sacrifices unto Jehovah, we are acting or we are behaving contemptuously toward him, toward Jehovah. And Jehovah has declared that he sees such contemptuous behavior as an abomination, as abhorrent, as detestable, of course, depending upon which English translation you're referencing. And to offer such an unacceptable animal sacrifice or offering to Jehovah is tantamount to homosexuality, tantamount to consuming unclean meats, and so forth. And this is all referenced here in Leviticus chapter 18, verse 22, and Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 22, respectively. Furthermore, Yah sees offering blemished animal sacrifices unto him as profaning his holy and righteous name. And when we talk about profaning his holy and righteous name, his righteous name, we're talking about his authority. We're talking about his person. We are treating him as if he is not worth it. He is nothing. Look at Leviticus chapter 22, verse 2. And the Lexham English Bible reads, "Tell Aaron and his sons that they must deal respectfully with the Israelites' votive offerings, and they must not profane my holy name, which they are consecrating to me. I am Jehovah." The bottom line, beloved, rendering unto Jehovah sacrifices and offerings was a key form of worship back in the day. No, it wasn't like today where we have lights, camera, and action praise and worship productions like we see performed through so many denominational and even some Messianic fellowships and congregations today. Now, I do not believe there's really anything wrong with some of the praise and worship services that take place in churches today. However, such performances are fraught with a great deal of error and self-indulgences that have the tendency of dismissing what Jehovah truly desires from his set-apart people in terms of their worship of him. You see, Yah establishes the rules. Yah establishes the means by which we are to worship him. And when we operate outside those rules and we operate outside those means, we are acting in a contemptuous manner towards him. We are showing contempt towards Jehovah. And Yah realizes we treat him with less honor and respect than we treat many of our social and government leaders. Just ask any of us. If we were invited to the White House to have lunch with the President of the United States, or for that matter, a senator or a congressperson or a celebrity over in Hollywood, we would put out all the stops. We would make ourselves so made up that we wouldn't even recognize ourselves. We would go to the nth degree, to make sure that we had everything in order and that we did everything precisely that we could in order to make a good impression. Well, then why don't we do that for Yah? That's what Yah was talking about back in his Malachi, in that section by Malachi. He says, you don't do that to your governors. You don't treat them with such contempt. Why are you doing it to me? So he sees right through our hypocrisy, and he doesn't like it. So let us never forget that Yah is a God who always examines. He tries the hearts of men, such as stated in Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 10. So how do we, or how can we violate this mitzvah today, given that Yah has halted the temple and tabernacle sacrificial system for the time being? Well, we violate this mitzvah of offering blemished sacrifices to Yah when we cheat Yah of the time we are supposed to render to him, such as in our study of his word, our prayer, our fasting, the production of good fruit. When we skimp on our tithes and offerings, when we engage in half-hearted sacrifices of praise. And that's just 3 examples. I'm sure if you think about it, you could come up with many, many more. So with that said, let's move on to section 2, which deals with apostasy and apostates. How does the Hebrew governmental system address apostasy and apostates? The spiritual tone that Jehovah set for these mitzvot is found in the first 2 of Jehovah's 10 commandments. And the 10 commandments are found in Exodus chapter 20. But let's look at the first 2, which is found in verses 2 through 6 of Exodus chapter 20. And it reads, I am the Lord your God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Verse 3. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Verse 4. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Verse 5. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I am the Lord, Jehovah, thy God, thy Elohim, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the 3rd and 4th generation of them that hate me. Verse 6, but showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments. And this is the KJV rendering of Exodus chapter 20, verse 2 through 6. Essentially, Yah was saying here to us that he was the one who redeemed us from the land of Egypt and out of the house of bondage. Thus, we now belong to him and him alone. And so, that being said, Yah vehemently prohibits us from engaging in any form of idolatry and idol worship. And to engage in idolatry would not only violate Yah's instructions or his commandments, but it would also violate our covenant relationship with him. To transgress these mitzvot, these commandments, would cause Yah's wrath to be visited upon us and upon our children for what? Several generations. We find in our Torah reading, Deuteronomy 17, verses 2 through 5, where it is mentioned that any man or woman who knowingly engages in pagan worship must be executed after a court has proven their indiscretion to be true. When the matter is made known to anyone in the congregation, in the community, in the nation, that indiscretion, that violation of Torah, that apostasy, it must be judiciously acted upon. It must be dealt with. Why? Because a little leaven leaveneth the whole lump, according to the Apostle Paul. And this is recorded in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 6, and Galatians chapter 5, verse 9. I'd love to get into that, but for the sake of time, I want to keep this as close to an hour as I possibly can. Now, it's interesting that Moses, was particularly calling out worship of the heavenly bodies here in these 3 verses. And of course, to engage in such worship was to have a created being, us humans, worship created things, such as the sun, moon, and stars. So worship of heavenly bodies has throughout human history been an indelible stronghold among many nation peoples. And Paul found himself having to go to battle and eradicate worship of the heavenly bodies, even within some of the Messianic communities he oversaw. And I would refer you to Galatians chapter 4, verse 3 and 9, as well as Colossians chapter 2, verses 8 and 20. Now, clearly, this mitzvah cannot be carried out as written today. We can't just take people out and stone them and kill them. We can't engage in capital punishment because someone decides to go and worship Hasatan, to engage in witchcraft, and so forth. However, the spirit of this mitzvah is clear. We are not to permit individual members of our fellowship who engage in ungodly acts to remain in our midst. Period. They must be, after a judicial inquiry is made, ejected, dismissed from the congregation, dismissed from our midst. Now, I've given a whole number of related passages where we talk about there being the necessity of having 2 or 3 witnesses to facilitate the inquiry process. One who engages in paganism or idolatry cannot be sentenced and put to death unless there are 2 or 3 witnesses. Period. It's just the way Father set it up. Deuteronomy 19, verse 15. The testimony of a single witness may not be used to convict with respect to any crime and for any wrongdoing in any offense that a person committed. On the evidence of 2 or on the evidence of 3 witnesses, a charge shall be sustained. Numbers chapter 35, verse 30. If anyone kills a person, the killer will be put to death according to the testimony of witnesses. But someone cannot die on testimony of one person. And I've gone ahead and listed a number of supporting passages to this. In the show's manuscript, for your convenience, I would encourage you to check it out at your convenience. And so this commandment that 2 or 3 witnesses is required to convict one who is to be executed is found in verse 6 of our Torah reading passage. Now, when we get down to verse 7, we find that the witnesses of the crime are to be the first to stone the one who is convicted of the felony, the apostasy, the idolatry, the paganism. And then the rest of the community engages in the execution. We find in John chapter 8, verse 7, where it is recorded, and when they persisted in asking him being Yeshua, straightening up, he said to them, the one of you without sin, let him throw the first stone at her. Many in denominationalism who do not read and study Torah would have no idea why Yeshua said such a thing about casting the first stone. It's framed in a way that, these people were being hypocritical. They were being unrighteous. So the one who is without sin needs to cast the first stone. That is true. And there are other elements of spiritual elements associated with that. But Yeshua was tying this back to this Torah commandment here in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 7, where the one who is the witness must cast the first stone. The 2 or 3 witnesses are the ones to cast the first stones in the execution. Then we find in verses 8 through 11 that those cases that are too complex or too challenging for the local courts, the local judges to decide, must be brought to the attention of the faith leaders in the capital. In our case, it would have been Jerusalem. When the tabernacle was existing, it would have been places like Shiloh. But specifically, the place of Yah's choosing, depending on the dispensation. It was wherever the tabernacle was or wherever the temple was. And the temple was always in Jerusalem. Why at either the tabernacle or the temple? Why did Yah require this? Because such complex judgments required that the judges be near Yah's presence in order to render the proper sentence and ruling. And whatever those leaders determined would be the course of action taken against the perpetrator of that crime, that court's ruling had to be carried out to the letter of their ruling. There was to be no deviation in the carrying out of their edict on our part. The idea behind this non-deviation instruction was that the high court's ruling would in such complex cases be as though the ruling came directly from Jehovah himself. Now that court's ruling came with divine authority. And so in Yeshua's day, the local or city Sanhedrins and ultimately the great Sanhedrin in Yerushalayim fulfilled this mitzvah, where the judges ruled on violations, serious violations of Torah. And as it relates to the great Sanhedrin headquartered at the temple, Tim Haig of Torah Resources wrote that, quote, the sages teach that it was near the altar that the Sanhedrin would render their judgments, and that coming into the court and laying hold of the horns of the altar was a signal to the judges that an individual required an halakhic decision, a how to walk out one's faith decision, or a ruling on a matter, end quote. Again, that is from his commentary on this Torah reading. Unfortunately, these entities were mostly corrupt. These judges, these tribunals were corrupt. And more times than not, they failed to render godly justice. Case in point, Yeshua's trumped up trial with false witnesses that were arrayed against him ultimately led to him being convicted of heresy and condemned to Roman execution. In verse 12 of 17, we find that evil must always be purged from our midst, from Israel. And any who treats the rulings of Yah's priestly council with contempt, they too must be executed. Verse 13, the point behind such harsh instructions, the capital punishment, if you will, is to ensure that the congregation fears Jehovah. The congregation of Yisrael fears Jehovah and the government that he has put in place over that nation. And it prevents presumptuous behavior by the people. Capital punishment, when it came to pagan and idol worship, according to Haig, served, quote, both a satisfying of his being Yah's justice, as well as a deterrent to such sins. And one remedy that helps prevent the spread of pagan and idol worship is studying the weekly Torah readings for us today. So when we engage in steadfast Torah reading and meditation, which should involve the whole of Scripture, the Torah, the prophets, and the apostolic, and we meditate upon those truths contained therein, we are blessed because we will not walk in the counsel of ungodly, nor stand in the ways of sinners, but instead gain our wisdom from meditating in Yah's Torah day and night. And in so doing, we become, as the psalmist describes, trees planted by the rivers of water that bring forth proper and delightful fruit in their season. And whatever we do will prosper. Psalm chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. Then last section, we have that of the king to rule over Israel. And this is contained in the last 6 verses of chapter 17, verses 14 through 20. The Torah on Israel installing a king to rule over them. And contrary to teachings, Jehovah never forbid us from installing a human king to rule over us in the land. The Hebraic purpose of a human king was, of course, to provide his nation leadership and protection from surrounding warring nations. And he would also serve in the capacity of a judge, as well as we saw illustrated in the case of Solomon, when he decided the famous dispute of 2 women claiming that a child was theirs, back in 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 16 through 28. But above all else, without the Hebraic government structure of Jehovah, the king was God's servant. He was God's servant first and foremost. He was subject to Yah's instructions and leading, and he was ultimately responsible for setting an example and leading the nation in her covenant relationship with the Almighty. And so Yah stipulated that we adhere to a set of uncompromising standards for the installation of a presumptive king. The first and foremost, that after we had settled in the land, that it seems good to us to have a human king rule over us, that man must be one whom Yah chooses. The presumptive king must be chosen by Yah, and he is chosen through the mouth of a prophet. Secondly, he cannot be a foreigner. He must in fact be one of our kinsmen. Third, he is not to amass unto himself a massive cavalry or army. Why? Because the king was supposed to trust in Yah to provide defensive and offensive protection and might for the nation. Not so that the king will rest and trust in the size and strength of his army, but trust and rely on the strength and capabilities of our Creator, Jehovah. Fifth, the presumptive king would be prohibited from entering military and diplomatic agreements with Egypt. Yah didn't want us going back to Egypt. He said, I don't want you going back there. He said, you cannot enter into any kind of agreement with the Egyptians. Sixth, the presumptive king was not to take unto himself multiple wives. Why? Because the wives would influence the king to transgress the covenant relationship that he himself had with Jehovah, but also the covenant that the nation would have. Because being the leader of the nation, the spiritual and governmental leader of the nation, he set the example. And when he would he would acquiesce to his wives, who were pagans, and follow their gods, so does the nation. The nation would follow suit as well. And Father knew that he said, that's why you should not have multiple wives, because they will lead you down a road to destruction. Seventh, the presumptive king was prohibited from amassing wealth for himself in the form of silver and gold. Again, it's not about making himself trust in his riches, but trust in Jehovah. Eighth, the presumptive king must write for himself a copy of this Torah from the master manuscript held and maintained by the Levitical priest. He was to read this copy of Torah all the days that he sat on the throne that Yah has given him. And the purpose of this mitzvah, Yah's chosen king must always be mindful of the ways of Jehovah. He must fear Yah, diligently observe Yah's instructions in righteousness. Period. So there's a lot more that I would like to go in, but I have come close to my hour limit, and I want to bring this to a close. So what is the practical application here? There's very little that we can make out in the way of a direct physical application of the mitzvot, the commandments that are contained in our reading this week. But our Jewish and Hebrew brothers remain in a diaspora, even an exile state to a greater or lesser extent. And although there is supposedly a Sanhedrin in existence in the land of Israel, there is no Mishkan. There is no temple for which they would operate out of. And our Jewish brethren insist that there are no longer any legitimate prophets, and the Levitical priesthood is currently shelved, at least in terms of any viable temple operations. They're trying to drum up a Levitical priesthood that could actually do sacrifices, but that is very limited. As it relates to a king, the nation state of Israel, well, they've gone the way of the Western nations and they operate via a form of democracy that essentially denies Jehovah as that nation's husband and head. So, how should we Nazarene Israelites approach this reading? Well, like most of our Torah readings, where much of the content has been temporarily shelved because of the present governmental and spiritual state of Israel, doesn't facilitate a complete return to its former Hebraic functioning. Well, thus we must consider these commandments, these mitzvot, these instructions from a spiritual and truth perspective. In particular, we are led to study the words of such readings each week from the perspective of shadow pictures, of them being shadows of good things to come, of seeing the person and ministries of Yeshua, our Messiah, and our older brother emerge from the pages of our reading. And upon seeing Yeshua in many aspects of our reading, we are afforded the opportunity to walk out our faith in fear and trembling, such that we please our Heavenly Father. And as I mentioned previously in this discussion, Master Yeshua fulfilled perfectly every role and function of Yah's government structure. He was the righteous judge. He was a righteous priest. Well, he is a righteous judge, a righteous and holy priest. He is that prophet whom Moses foretold Yah would raise up unto us from our midst, and of whom we must hearken. Deuteronomy 18:15. He is the King of kings and Lord of lords, as John recorded in Revelation 17, verses 14 through 16. He shall rule over us and over this world with a rod of iron. Revelation 2:27, Revelation 12:5, and Revelation 19:15. There shall be no end to his kingdom. Isaiah 9:7, Luke 1:33. He will bring about the final redemption of his people Yisrael and restore the paradise that was lost. Well, I'm going to end it there. I pray that you have a wonderful, restful, and blessed Shabbat, and that you have an overcoming week. And until next time, and as always, beloved, may you be most blessed, fellow saints in training. Take care.